Today's episode is an exploration of organized crime, specifically Chicago's corruption in the 1970s and 1980s, how the mob used policemen, judges, aldermen, state senators, and others to control the city, but more broadly an exploration of how the American criminal system is vulnerable to fixes and bribes, and what has changed over the last few decades and what hasn't changed. Today's guest is Jake Halpern. He is the host of the new podcast series Deep Cover, Mobland, which follows Halpern's investigation into the criminal underworld of the mob, from gamblers and bookies, political bosses, and judges. At the center of the story is Bob Cooley, a lawyer and fixer who helped the mob rule the city, then betrays them by going undercover with the FBI. In this episode, we'll look at the tangled web of corruption and crime where murderers operated without fear of retribution, and innocence was just a bribe away. When Cooley became an informant, it led to a number of arrests. It slowly led to a number of arrests, starting with small-level bookies, then going up the chain, eventually leading to the prosecution of prominent mob figures and politicians, with the entire operation resulting in more than 24 arrests, including cops, lawyers, judges, and more. And the fallout is still playing out in Chicago's courtrooms today. So why did Bob Cooley turn informant? Did he really have a change of heart, or was this for self-protection? Also, how was the mob able to operate with little worry that they would be implicated for anything they did? Finally, what was the fallout when this huge criminal web came unspooled, and how did it affect the city? It's a really fascinating exploration of organized crime, so I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Jake Halpern. Jake, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be on here.
Well, we're going to talk about something that is a proud American tradition, and that's city corruption. And in one sense, this is something that's the story of almost every major metropolitan area in the United States. In the 19th century, with the spoils system, when a new mayor is elected, he would be able to give political positions to his cronies. There's not really a bureaucracy that stays on from administration to administration. And then later on in the 19th century, as more immigrants come to the United States, and there isn't a robust social safety net, this allows machine politics to come in and sometimes the mob to come in and provide an informal social safety net. And this story is repeated across the United States, but it ebbs as the 20th century goes on. Yet that's not really the case in Chicago. There's something about Chicago where it's kind of the preeminent city when it comes to corruption, perhaps a preeminent city when it comes to mafia involvement, although they're contenders there. What do you think it is about Chicago where it stays corrupt longer than other cities? Do you think there was a pre-existing corruption that the mob leveraged to their advantage in the podcast series that you did and the time period that it takes place? Or did the mob create the corruption?
Well, it's kind of a classic chicken and the egg scenario, which came first. I mean, I think that my take on it is that corruption has always existed in some form, probably dating back to the very earliest forms of government, that there was always someone looking to profit on the government side, and there was always someone looking to kind of get their way that had coin in their pocket. And that exists in many American cities. Buffalo, where I grew up in, which is a Rust Belt city, kind of like Chicago. It existed in New York, obviously, with Tammany Hall. I think what happens in Chicago is that the mob, or the outfit as it's known, is kind of has an outsized power and importance going right back to Capone. And so what happens is that they are able to get their foot in the door and kind of monopolize the business of corruption relatively early on in a very significant way. And so therefore, after that, any attempts to cut back on that corruption are made more difficult because you're dealing with a powerful presence, which is the outfit. So I think corruption comes first, but when the mob or the outfit puts its foot in the door, and if it's powerful like it was in Chicago, then it becomes that much harder to get them out.
Getting into the details of how corruption actually worked in Chicago, and you look at the period from the 1970s to 2010, this is an interesting phase where some of the older forms of racketeering die out due to changes in federal law. It's not as easy to run large mafia organizations where you have lower level people on the street and then legally they can't be connected to those who are higher up. With changes that happen in federal law, many people are indicted. New York is somewhat cleaned up in the 1980s, but Chicago seems to evolve. So what does this look like, broadly speaking, with everybody involved, from policemen to aldermen to lawyers, cops, judges, and everybody else. How does this system work? I know it's a big question, but what were you able to understand based on how you looked at it?
Yeah, well, so the way that I came to think of it is that the mob, or again, the outfit as it's called in Chicago, operates almost like a franchise or a corporate kind of presence, where it offers people that join it some benefits, if you will. But instead of dental or your health insurance, one of the primary things that they can offer their members is protection from prosecution, immunity in some form or another from the long arm of the law. And so this means that it's really important for the outfit to maintain its system of corruption, because without it, it can no longer offer that benefit to its members. So in a funny way, yes, the corruption is useful to conduct all of the illegal activities that they want to conduct, whether it's prostitution or gambling or drugs or what have you. But also, it's hugely important to kind of maintaining morale among its ranks, a sense that like belonging to this organization has benefits, because as long as we stick with them, we're going to be more or less protected. And so what that means is they need a kind of robust head of government affairs. And this is the character that I identify in the podcast, this guy named Pat Marcy. I call him the mob's political czar. He's basically the guy that they rely upon to make sure that if there are people get in trouble with the law, even significant trouble, like a hitman getting charged with murder, that there's an apparatus in place where the right judge will be taken care of and that person will be able to get off. So Marcy operates through something called known informally as the First Ward. It's really the Democratic machine for the First Ward. The First Ward is one of Chicago's many political districts, but the First Ward was known as the mob's ward. And Marcy is he has a kind of nominal position there, a kind of secretary position, but everyone knows he's the guy to go to take care of business, whatever that is, whether it's getting someone off or even getting a law through the state legislature. And so the mob has a fully functioning kind of government affairs department, if you will.
Why do you think it was able to operate with little consequence and not much fear that they would be shut down for as long as they did?
It's a good question. I don't feel like I have a complete silver bullet answer, but I think that part of it was almost a sense of some resignation or acceptance on the part of the prosecutors and of law enforcement. There was the sense that these guys, it's like termites in the house, and the termites are so ubiquitous that there's almost a sense of shrugging your shoulders and saying, we can't beat them. I talked to this one prosecutor named Gary Shapiro, and he was in charge of the task force on the federal side that was responsible for going after the mob. And he said a few things to me that I found were very interesting. He said that when he was starting in the 70s, there was a mob murder, for example, almost every week. I mean, it was just a regular thing in the headlines. And there was this sense that this was just part of the ebb and flow of the rhythm of the city, and that there was not even really much that could be done about it. It was a kind of almost like what fell within the kind of theoretical red light district of the city, in the sense that it was like, we can't stop that. And even when they did get a case that felt like they had traction, Gary said one of his first big cases where things were lining up to prosecute the mob, on the eve of trial, the star witness was killed. So obviously that stymies that particular prosecution. But I think it also sends this kind of message to prosecutors that's saying, you can't touch us, so don't bother. And it's not to say that everyone was fully deterred by that, but I do think that it created a base level deterrent where there was this sense that the mob and its corruption had a kind of permanence in this city, in the sense that to some extent, you look for openings to take them down, but there's a sense that there's maybe nothing we're ever going to be able to do about this. And that impression and that kind of resignation kind of almost becomes part of the air that everyone's breathing in the city.
Another factor too, and this is the last bit of table setting before looking at the particular characters in your podcast series. What are positive benefits to society that the outfit provides? Because I think with organized crime, we always mentally go to Martin Scorsese movies or imagine violence and roughing people up and extortion and fear. Of course, that's a part of it. And there's no question that's a part of it. But ruling only by fear is an ineffective means to do so. Why do so when you can't provide social services for people? The example that I've provided many times on this podcast series is Tom Pendergast, who ran my native Kansas City like a Caesar in the early 20th century. But he provided legitimate social services to people. He, particularly poor immigrant classes that maybe had difficulty securing employment, maybe didn't have access to food or healthcare. He funded hospitals, he funded food giveaways and all sorts of other things. So there's always an element of the consent of the governed that in our understanding of constitutional theory, authority comes from the consent of the governed. What is the outfit you think is positively providing?
No, it's a great question. And yeah, of course, they're not just ruling by fear. They're providing services to people that they can't get elsewhere. So they're providing loans, loan sharking. They're, for people that might not have access to traditional realms of credit, they can take out a street loan. They're providing opportunities for people who want to gamble. There's prostitution. There's vengeance if someone does you wrong and the law has not been able to bring that person to justice. You can go to the mob. I remember my dad was a lawyer in Buffalo, and I remember he told me this story that I'll never forget as a kid, that he helped this guy who'd been cheated and bringing a lawsuit, and the guy was partially compensated, but didn't get all of his money back. And my dad's name was Steve, and the client said to him afterwards, Steve, if I were to do this again, I'd go right to the mob. And I think that this all speaks to very real things that the mob offered to people in Chicago that were useful, that were valued, and they couldn't get elsewhere. And so when they wouldn't cooperate against the mob, yes, of course, there's fear of retribution, but there's also a sense that this is an organization that is useful to me, that I know I can rely on in some situations, even if it's a matter of providing protection money for your shop, and you maybe grudgingly pay protection money each week. You do know that if someone rips you off, they're going to be on top of it with a kind of sense of urgency and vengeance that the police may not have. I would just add, and this is a little bit far afield, but you hear about this even in situations like Hamas in the West Bank, where, you can call them a terrorist organization, you can debate their various tactics. But one thing that you do hear is that, at least in the past, in periods of time, Hamas has provided services for people that live there that are valued. They're not ruling entirely out of fear. So usually I completely agree with you, for organizations to last, there's typically some usefulness that they offer.
Right. And it's not that it's correct, but at least in the United States, police generally don't arrest offensively. I mean, you could have counterexamples, stop and frisk, whatnot. But there are many cases where if, let's say, there's domestic violence, the police may say, well, unless we have XYZ proof, we can't really prosecute anyone. In a sense, the mafia can act as sort of the enforcers of unwritten law. If there's someone that a neighborhood collectively doesn't like, maybe there's one person in the neighborhood that's causing problems for everyone, but the police can't do anything, call somebody up to rough them up, and hey, that can take care of it. So let's give the mafia credit where credit is due.
Absolutely. I get it. There's the story that I think of sometimes is in the neighborhood where I live, there's a teenage kid that drives around recklessly in his pickup truck. And every time I see this kid, I think this kid's going to kill someone eventually. And the funny thing is everyone knows this kid. It's not like his identity is some sort of secret. You don't really call the cops on a kid like this, but you might, if you knew someone who was in the mob, say, ask them to pay this family a visit and say, hey, cut it out before you run over someone. So I agree with you. There are inevitably aspects of society where the government falls short. And that's why I suspect there will always be some space for organized crime to exist.
Let's get into the particulars of your story. And someone very interesting is Bob Cooley. So first, tell me about him. What did he do with the mob? And what eventually makes him have, I suppose, a change of heart, or at least causes him to flip?
Right. So Bob, just to get a sense for Bob and his whole background, he comes from a family of Irish cops. His grandfather was a cop. His father was a cop. His brothers were a cop. There's about 8 or 9 siblings in the family. And this just is a kind of tradition in the family. And in fact, in an interesting note, his grandfather was a police officer who was killed on the job. And it appears that And the murderer, we know for a fact, was acquitted at trial, and it appears that the case was fixed. So this idea of corruption and of police and the mob, I mean, it plays out in the city, but it plays out personally in Bob's family. So Bob grows up and he's a cop for a while, but he's kind of the black sheep of the family. From the very earliest time, he's kind of breaking the rules. He's cheating on the tests. He's driving his very kind of upright father kind of crazy. And when he leaves the police, he eventually goes to become a lawyer, and he enters the court system in Chicago. And he has this thing happen to him on the very first day as a lawyer. He has a client who was a DUI, and he goes before the judge, and the judge throws the case out, just clean throws it out. And Bob he's pleased that he won, but he can't really figure out why. And in the hallway afterwards, he bumps into another he knows named Jimmy. And Jimmy says, "This one's on the house. The next one you got to pay for." And Bob knows that Jimmy's cousin is the judge, and the Jimmy is effectively operating as the judge's bagman. And this was Bob's very quick crash course introduction to how the justice system worked in Chicago, which was that if you wanted to win on behalf of your clients, you typically or had to place a bribe. That was the safest way to win. And it was that the fixers were in the hallway. The moneylenders were throughout the temple. And Bob falls into this. And before long, he's fixing all kinds of cases, first in traffic court, then he's operating a place that he calls guns and gambling court, or bookies, and people on gun charges come in. And it's in his capacity as he's making reputation in this way that he's eventually approached by Pat Marcy. He's the guy we mentioned earlier, who is basically the political mob for the czar, a political czar for the mob. And Marcy basically has heard about Bob and wants to basically retain Bob's services as a fixer in a very important trial.
What does it look like as he becomes a fixer, and what does he do in this trial?
Yeah, well, I should pause for just a second to say, so I interviewed Bob for almost a year, and I was kind of fascinated / disturbed at how Bob came to take all these bribes, and he kept on falling back on this argument that he's made to me repeatedly that, Jake, you don't understand. This was normative at the time. This is basically what everyone was doing. Bob had he even kind of often said to me, like, they weren't exactly bribes. They were more like tips. They were more like sweeteners. To me, it was very instructive how when anything is normative, you stop seeing it as a transgression. And of course, there are people who do avoid this. One of them is Bob's brother. He's got a completely clean-cut brother named Dennis who refuses to take a bribe, and that's a whole interesting breakdown. But Bob kind of gradually just accepts this is the way it is. I'm not doing anything anyone else is doing. But when Marcy approaches him, and that's the mob's political czar, Marcy basically tells him there's a trial for the murder of a teamster. A guy named Billy Logan was shot and killed. And the guy who did the murder, according to Marcy, what Marcy tells him, is this guy named Harry Alaman, who was a reputed hitman for the mob. And Marcy is basically inquiring with Bob, do you know a judge who might be able to handle the matter? Everything was being set in code, right? So that, if it was ever being taped, you could kind of have plausible deniability. And Bob immediately sets out to see if he can find a judge who can handle the matter. But not just that, Bob has this whole way of thinking about fixing a case. And it's worth just explaining that there needs to be enough reasonable doubt that there's enough for what Bob says for the judge to hang his hat on. In other words, Bob can't go to a judge and ask that judge to throw the case if there's no evidence that the defendant might be innocent. There has to be enough there that Bob can say, come on, you'll make a little money. This is probably the way you were going to rule anyway. There's plenty of cover here if you take this. That was Bob's approach. So in a weird way, when Bob is asked to fix a case, he has to do his homework. And he starts looking into this case to see whether there is enough doubt here. And he comes to conclude that there's two witnesses, but it was dark out at night. One witness was the accomplice, so he's not credible. The other guy might not have seen it so well. And he concludes, you know what, there's enough for our judge to hang a hat on. And then he finds a judge who he kind of induces to basically take the bribe and to throw the case.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. What happens from there on out with his relationship with the Mafia and what causes him to flip against them?
Right. So to understand the kind of how Bob ascends, because he basically ascends to become the mob's guy. And it really hinges on this trial of Harry Aldermen. I mean, it kind of had an almost like OJ-like level of public attention, at least within Chicago at the time. Everyone's watching it because it was highly unusual that a hitman would even be indicted or prosecuted in the first place. And so as the trial is going on and it's building visibility, Bob starts to worry that maybe the judge will get cold feet. And in fact, when the day that the verdict is announced by the judge, Bob actually gets in his car and starts to leave town, basically fleeing town, out of fear that maybe the judge will get cold feet, rule him guilty, and Bob will be on the hook. So there's this moment where Bob's in the car, he's listening to the radio, and he hears the announcement on the radio that Harry Aldermen, the defendant, the reputed hitman, has been found innocent. And Bob literally turns his car around and drives back into the city because he knows that he's done it. He's kind of pulled this off. And even though it's this really terrible miscarriage of justice, it is a kind of proof positive that if you're in some deep trouble, Bob is the guy that's going to basically bail you out. And so for the next few years, he's kind of the mob's golden guy as one of their fixers to get things done. But what Bob realizes is that when you work for the mob and when you're the mob's guy, you do exactly as you're told. And this comes to a head in a few matters, one in particular where Bob finds out there's a client of his who's talked to the feds in the past and the mob intends to kill him. And Bob basically warns this guy and helps him get away. And this kind of plants the seeds for a kind of unraveling of Bob's relationship with the mob, where he's not always doing what they're telling him. They're telling him, you better do what you're told. And it sets us up the scenario where in 1986, things have frayed badly enough that Bob shows up at the office of a federal prosecutor and says, basically, I'm the mob's lawyer. I can give you all kinds of secrets about how the mob operates, and I can help bring down the first ward, which is the mob's political stronghold. And the prosecutor at the time, this guy, Gary Shapiro, I interviewed him and he said, I thought there was a good chance that he was a nut job, that he had like a messiah complex, because it made no sense why he would walk in our door. And he said, and yet, who am I to say no to the messiah? Because what Bob was promising was so grand that even if he was a little bit crazy, and even if he was even a plant, they were worried that maybe he was a mole planted by the mob. It was enticing enough, it was tantalizing enough that they wanted to at least start going down the process of seeing if he was for real. And so they bring in the FBI, and the FBI starts vetting Bob, much the way the CIA might if a Soviet defector walked in off the street.
I mean, this raises a lot of interesting questions on how much you trust somebody who flips, because if he's spent a good part of his career playing angles and working in an illegitimate system, then is this just another form of protection? And you interviewed him a number of times, as you mentioned earlier. What did you make of him as you were talking with him? And were you able to, I suppose, suss out any motivations for why he flipped?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. And I have to tell you that I approached Bob very skeptically. I mean, in a way, Gary Shapiro's skepticism, the prosecutor's skepticism of why this guy was walking into their office and cooperating was very much my skepticism as a journalist, which is that this guy, as you rightly say, plays all the angles. And so how much can we really believe him? And so I guess in some ways what I did mirrors what the feds did, which is that I began talking to as many people as I could to try to figure out, is this guy credible? Is he telling the truth? When is he being straight with me? When is he not being straight with me? I interviewed all of his siblings. I interviewed his two handlers at the FBI. I interviewed the U.S. attorney that prosecuted the case. I interviewed his secretary and kind of on and off lover throughout the time. I mean, it was just like all these conversations. And then we got a hold of the wiretaps that he starts to make. And through that, you start to get a sense of who this guy is. And okay, back to your exact question, which is why did he do it? I think it's complicated. There's a number of reasons. One reason that Bob gives is that there was kind of a deathbed confession by his father. If you remember, his father was a straight, honest cop who, at the very end of his life, kind of has this moment with Bob and says, "Why are you wasting your God-given talents with these people being the mob?" And Bob says that this kind of was a moment for him. Bob would also say that I wanted to do the right thing. To me, the way that I kind of came, there was another theory out there that Bob did it because he had gambling debts. And I looked deep into that. And in the end, I didn't find any of those reasons completely credible. The way that I came to think about it was that Bob was a survivor. And he was also someone who was a student of power dynamics. And in some ways, he's drawn to the mob for the reason that it offers a power that even trumps the power of the law in Chicago. But eventually, when he's told that he has to kowtow and scrape and bow and do whatever they say, I think the survivor in him and the kind of the player in him is looking for not just a way out, but for a way to best them. And the best way that he sees to do that is to go to the feds and start wearing a wire. Because once he does this, he's basically going to war with them to bring them down, but he's also bringing an arsenal of weapons that can bring them down, which is the FBI and all of its power. So I kind of came to actually see it as a power move on Bob's part.
Well, in that sense, he's very successful. The operation he's involved in, Operation Gambit, does bring down a number of people. What does that look like? Is he meeting with people, wearing his wire, gathering intelligence, and due to incriminating statements, this starts to take people out one by one, and then they're testifying against each other? Or what does this look like as the web becomes unraveled?
Right. So when the FBI starts cooperating with Bob, the first thing is that they don't believe him. And then they start to vet him and they start to check out what he's saying. And they become increasingly convinced that he really does know the people that he claims to know, and he does what he claims to do. But there's this whole other question of, be that as it may, does this guy have the ability, the savvy to be an undercover operative, to wear a wire and not get caught and to not be reckless? And so he wants to go after Bob, that is, wants to go after Pat Marcy right away. He's got an axe to grind with Marcy. Let's be clear about it. And the FBI is like, no. We're going to start off small fish, small potatoes here. And so they have him go after a low-level bookie, kind of like a trial run. And the trial run is a disaster. He basically shows up, and I know this from Bob's account, but I also know this from his two handlers who were there observing. And what happens is he goes to make a payoff to one of the bookies, one of the mob's bookies. One of the very first things he does, he steps out of the car, and the recorder that's on his leg attached with an ace bandage slides down his leg and just pops right out, like the moment his foot gets out of the car. And this guy he's about to go get on tape is sitting there in the window. And Bob just gets right back in the car and just motors away, leaves this guy standing at the window. And he meets his handlers back at the house. And he's terrified that he's been outed before he's even started. And so there's this moment like this whole thing might be a bust. But they kind of gathers himself. It turns out this guy didn't see the recorder. Bob straps it up again better, goes back, gets him on tape, and then starts building his way up to get bigger and bigger fish. He gets a senator, a state senator, who is an interesting character in his own right. He's also a poet, and bribes him to start the work to get a bogus law passed, and finally kind of graduates up to going after Pat Marcy, the top guy, which he does, again, wearing a wire and going into these meetings where he's trying to get him to kind of fix cases. But it's difficult because Marcy's really smart and he's not initially saying anything that's going to incriminate himself. So it takes about 3 years before Bob finally gets his shot at bringing down Marcy.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. As you looked into this operation, I'm curious, what do you think are things that most people get wrong when they think about the mob or corrupt city and state politics? I mean, we have ideas from movies and The Sopranos and other things like that have greater or lesser connections to reality. But as you dug in more and more, what are things that you think were the most counterintuitive that jumped out at you as you looked at this operation when you really got into the inner workings of how the mob and corrupt local politics actually work?
Yeah, so I think it probably goes back to this sense that I guess a few things that I found surprising. One of which was just how ubiquitous corruption was in Chicago. That basically, more or less, in the early 1980s, for example, almost anyone could walk into the courtroom. You didn't have to be connected to the mob, and you could pay your way out of pretty much anything. That changes with something called Operation Greylord, where they go undercover and bust a whole bunch of judges and prosecutors. And then the corruption becomes much more contained. Greylord really doesn't get the corruption that the mob itself is kind of in charge of. I'm trying to think what surprised me most about it in terms of the mob. I guess what I would say, and this is maybe just a kind of riff off. I remember there was a scene in The Sopranos where Tony basically is in therapy with Dr. Malfi, and he makes a reference to this and says something to the effect of, when my ancestors first got off the boat, we weren't allowed into the traditional fields of work. We were given the kind of dregs of what was available, and we kind of had to go into this in order to kind of scrape our way up in the new world. And I do think there's something to that. I mean, what I see when you're looking at the mob in Chicago, it's not it's way too reductive to just see them in this kind of villainous role that you see personified, for example, by Robert De Niro in The Untouchables, as Al Capone is just this maniac wielding a bat who just beats the hell out of some guy. I mean, I think that there's a tendency to kind of see the mob as a kind of morality play. And instead, what I see, it seems to me that Chicago was this place that was a tribal enclave, that, as it was explained to me, that the Irish had to kind of a lock on the police department, at least at this time. This was a kind of, and, there was an Irish mob for sure, but that the outfit, skewed more towards Italian Americans. And there was these kind of different tribal elements, and everyone was trying to carve out a part of the city in which they could exert some control and influence. And it was in some ways, yes, there was bad behavior that occurred in the mob, and this is not to excuse that for it, but to also think of it as a kind of tribal vying for power within the city and people getting what they could get to kind of provide for their own. Maybe you get some of that in some of the mob movies, but to me, that was really interesting from kind of a sociological standpoint.
Without giving away too much from your series, because I always respect spoiler alerts, what's the upshot of this operation and what changes with all the indictments and what doesn't change?
Right. Well, in some ways, it does not put an end to corruption in Chicago. And if you are from Chicago or following any of the Chicago news, you can see that Ed Burke, who's the longest serving city alderman, is being indicted for corruption as we speak. So it doesn't end corruption entirely. But what it does do is that it does break what I would say is something of a chokehold that the mob has on, or that the outfit, as they call it in Chicago, has on the city's justice system. And so that's important for a few reasons. It's important because that system of corruption is how you get things done in terms of providing illegal services, but it's also a benefit that you, as I mentioned earlier, that you offer to those in your organization. And if I'm like a would-be aspiring criminal in Chicago, and I'm looking at the outfit and I'm saying they don't control the legal system the way they once do, they don't run the courts and run the police, then what is my incentive to join them? In fact, if you take this idea of them as a tribe, or their power is diminished, and so they're less attractive for me to join. And I think that's what you start to see Gambat do as Gambat takes down some of their chief operators within this kind of corrupt machinery. And I would also just say that the podcast really comes to a head, and what drew me to this story, if I can just kind of make a little bit of plug for the storytelling here. What drew me to this story is that the story itself comes full circle. So when Bob, he goes undercover for like 3 years, in which he's gathering evidence wearing a wire, and you'll hear some of these wiretaps if you listen to the podcast. When he finally finishes the operation, he has to flee Chicago. And then a series of prosecutions occur in which the feds go after all the people that he's gathered tape on. And there's something like 9 trials that occur. And by far, the most fascinating of these trials is a retrial of the murder of Billy Logan, the Teamster, by the reputed hitman, Harry Aldermen. And if you remember from the beginning of our interview, I told the story where this was Bob's big break, where he fixed this trial and the hitman walked free. And one of the things that the Fed set out to do with Bob's help is to gather enough evidence to retry Harry Aldermen. And when that happens, Harry's defense is the US Constitution, which says no one can be placed in double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime. And this legal question is appealed all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And the resolution is you've got Bob here who's saying, I bribed the judge. And therefore, Harry Aldermen, the reputed hitman, was never really in any jeopardy in the first place. And therefore, the retrial of this hitman can go forward. And so the podcast kind of ends where the story begins, which is that Bob tries to right this wrong by putting this guy back on the trial, but there's significant fallout and these kind of very profound unintended consequences of what happens. And that I will withhold, and you'll have to listen to find out.
Well, I think all of this, it comes to a really interesting question that how much is the American criminal legal system still vulnerable to these types of bribes? That in the 70s and 80s, you had a more cash-based society. The mob infrastructure was more strongly in place. Some of the racketeering laws weren't there. On the one hand, there are the optimists and maybe even tech utopian people who think that, well, thanks to blockchain technology and being able to follow payments, the type of corruption that existed in the past with large bags of cash is impossible in a certain extent. And there's more scrutiny, there's more surveillance. We can track things much better. But on the other hand, I think that's just far more naive. And those tools wielded by criminals could be used in ways we would never even imagine. So how do you think the American criminal system today is vulnerable to these types of fixes and bribes now?
It's a good question. I think you're right. I think this whole kind of advent of forensic accounting, which was when it's, I think in its infancy, in the 80s, now, it makes it harder. And I think there's no question that there appears to be less of it than there once was in terms of judges taking cash and jurors being bought off. But I also think you're absolutely right that we should hesitate to congratulate ourselves for such a fantastically clean system, because I think there are other ways in which money unquestionably corrupts the system. And the most immediate that comes to mind is just the way that the people are represented that are brought up on charges. I think that, look, it doesn't take a genius to observe the system and say, if you're someone that has access to means and resources, you are going to be able to have the high-priced lawyers that are going to be able to try the case, appeal the case, have the private eyes that go out and gather the investigation, the challenge that slow this thing up, far better than the person who's stuck with the public defender. Yes, that was probably true back then, but it's certainly true now. And there's a strong argument to be made that this is a soft form of corruption, or a soft form of the way that money influences, warps, corrupts, etc., the way the justice is practiced. And that's, still the case. I'll tell you one other bit. It's not a direct answer to your question, but it's something that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. I was looking into one of the cases that Bob had put me onto where there had been murder, where the Bob strongly suspected that there had been corruption, but he wasn't able to prove it. And it involved a Black woman who appeared to have been murdered by her husband, or at the behest of her husband, and got away with it. And I was talking to the victim's sister and presenting with her with some of the evidence that Bob had put together, strongly indicating that a bribe had occurred. And I said to her, was it upsetting, or, was she shocked and upset when she found out, because she had talked to Bob, that the corruption was at play and this kind of miscarriage of justice with the prosecution of her sister's would-be murderer? And she said to me very candidly, Jake, as a Black woman in Chicago, I never had the expectation that I was going to get justice in the first place. And to me, I felt very naive at the moment about hearing this, but it reframed it. And it just made me realize that there's all sorts of different ways that the system is rigged against different people, whether it's because they don't have enough money or it's because of the color of their skin. And so I would say that, yes, is there corruption that exists today in the form of the kind of classic cash passing into the hands of a judge or a juror? Undoubtedly. But I think we'd almost be better served to look at the ways that justice is perverted or miscarried in these other ways that are filtered down through race and class, and which are very real for the folks who are affected.
All right. Well, I mean, this is only a small exploration of the story that you present over 10 episodes. And for listeners who want to dive in considerably more detail, the name of the series is Deep Cover Mobland. Jake, thank you for joining us.
Scott, it's been a true pleasure.
All right. That is it for today. If you would like to see show notes for this episode, along with all my others, go to parthenonpodcast.com. That's the name of the podcast network that I'm a part of, along with James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other great history shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, the two easiest ways to do so are to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. The second way is to join our membership program, and if you do so, you'll get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplugged.